characterized in a number of different ways. We could characterize philosophy as the rational pursuit of truths, truths which are conceived as answers to perennial and eternal questions. And this is one way of thinking about the various subdisciplines of philosophy. Metaphysics, or ontology, is the study of being, or the ultimate nature and structure of the universe. What is out there, and how does it relate to everything else? Ethics is the study of the nature of the good life, and the study of the nature of good itself, of value. And it's obviously closely associated with political philosophy, or the philosophy of politics, that examines the nature of political life and seeks to characterize such public virtues as, for example, justice, equality, and fraternity. Aesthetics examines the nature of the beautiful and its embodiment both in nature and in works of art. Epistemology examines the question of knowledge. We might think of it as the theory of knowledge. Specifically, it attempts to characterize the nature of truth, science and rational inquiry, and endeavors to offer criteria for each of those things, truth, science, and rational inquiry. We might think of philosophy of mind or psychology, philosophic psychology, as the study of the workings of the psyche, the soul or the mind, analyzing its functions and its mechanisms. And of course, natural philosophy attempts to offer us a rational account of the natural world, both organic and inorganic, again, with an eye towards rational explanation. But that's only one way of thinking about philosophy. We could also describe philosophy as an historical discipline. As such, would be subject to change over time. That would mean that different epochs are concerned with, in fact, rather different issues. For example, post-Platonic philosophy was concerned with metaphysical and ethical issues. They were really the core of its concentration and focus. Early Christian philosophy was interested in theology and metaphysics, the relationship of the divine to the human, and God's working out his providential plan in time and space. Modern philosophy, by contrast, has been concerned far more with epistemological issues, issues about the nature of science and truth and rational inquiry, as well as political considerations, as publics have emerged to become important political forces. On another level, we might say that philosophic questions that prove tractable give us a very interesting insight into the history of this discipline. For example, once such problems prove tractable, amenable to fairly straightforward solutions, they often cease to remain philosophical. For example, the natural philosophers, Galileo and Newton, were so successful in their endeavors that the subject they created, or the discipline, became a separate discipline, that which we know as physics, and in particular, mechanics. We might think of the political speculations of many post-Machiavellian theorists as having laid the groundwork for the new disciplines of political science, sociology, and indeed even economics. And finally, we might note that the phenomenological analyses of post-Humean philosophers, which is to say, philosophers who examined the phenomenological or immediate experience we have in our mental life, that sort of analysis, originating in philosophy, gave rise to the modern discipline of experimental philosophy. The principle of association, the notion of stimulus and response, which make up the very core of modern experimental and behavioral psychology, all trace their legacies to philosophy. Just as existentialism and the philosophy of mind combine to result in the birth of modern psychoanalysis. So one might think of philosophy as an historical study of intractable problems, that as problems become tractable, they cease to be philosophical. This requires us to be aware that different epochs not only are concerned with different issues, but frame those issues differently. For example, In the ancient world, metaphysics was oriented around the issue of hylomorphism, which is the relation of form or structure to content or matter, right? And that dominated both the thought of Plato and Aristotle. But Christian metaphysics, as a point of contrast, was organized around the relation between the fallen world of man and the realm of the divine. So a very different way of framing the same questions of what is there, what is the universe made of, emerge in different epochs. Again, modern metaphysics has been organized around dualisms, the dualism of mind and body, and most importantly, the dualism of the empirical and mechanistic, and the ideal or supersensible. Similarly, we might note that the mind of the ancient Greeks, nous as it were, was characterized by its participation in universal concepts, right? What made something a mind was its ability to grasp universals. This is in stark contrast to our post-Cartesian understanding of mind. It is not, in fact, defined by its ability to apprehend universals and universal concepts. Quite the opposite. It is characterized by its experience of particular phenomenological states, i.e., the modern post-Cartesian mind is characterized by immediate feelings which are never universal but are always particular and individual to the person who has them, states like pain or doubt or pleasure, which are unique and in some sense ineffable because each person has exclusively privileged access to their own phenomenological states. So even a topic like philosophy of mind changes dramatically over time as people think about mind in a different way. Plato's mind was not only subject to universals, but was universal. One could speak of nature, in a sense, having nous or mind. One can't do that in the phenomenological case of Descartes. Again, the political philosophy of both Plato and Aristotle presupposed that political association was natural for man. Man is a zoon politikon, or a political animal. That was an essential part of his nature, that we would never find men outside of political associations. Contrast that to modern social theorists, like, say, Hobbes or Locke. They instead assume that the state of man naturally, what they call the state of nature, is an isolated state in which each individual lives on his own prior to political association, and that the motivations of such individuals are always self-interested, rather than interested towards the good of the polis as a whole. This also means that philosophy and its practitioners occupy different cultural and social roles in different epochs, and this is, I think, very important. Socrates and Plato, for example, were both social and cultural critics, and they took an extremely adversarial relationship to their given cultural and political authorities. Both Socrates and Plato rejected the teachings of religious authority, principally that of Homer, and also criticized the existing democratic practices of Athens. Medieval philosophers generally found themselves in the employ of the church. They were generally churchmen or university professors who taught at universities associated with the church. And as a result of that, philosophy was conceived to be, in the words of Aquinas, the handmaid of theology. So both philosophy and the philosopher had a different social role than in the ancient world. And in modern philosophy and modern philosophers, we find again that they tend to be critical. They offer criticisms of society, or often will try to serve as cultural referees, judging the veracity, tenability, and legitimacy of various discourses and disciplines, deploying criterion of truth and rationality to judge the various arts, humanities, and sciences. But, and I think this is the third way we have to think about philosophy, philosophy is also certainly what its name implies, to translate from the Greek, the love of wisdom. In this sense, philosophy is ultimately born of contemplative wonder and a sense of awe towards the nature of being and the universe. As such, philosophy both expresses a posture towards being, a sort of metaphysical stance, and seeks to fulfill both spiritual and existential needs, as well as purely rational and explanatory rules. Ancient philosophy thus begins with a combination of rational curiosity and reverence, the same combination found in their precursors, and there were precursors to the philosophers, the famed gymnosophists of the ancient subcontinent, the naked forest speculators who we call yogas or yogis to this day, and who many people have argued were in fact precursors to Socrates. Okay, let's begin now with the first epoch of the birth of philosophy in the ancient and classical world, that of the pre-Socratics. For the pre-Socratics really represent the birth of Western philosophy, a Western philosophical speculation that began in the greater Greek diaspora. Well, the first phase of pre-Socratic thought was devoted to understanding the world of nature, the natural world, or what we might describe as the world of objects. The Ionians, for example, sought to understand the natural world by reducing its multiplicity to a finite number of entities, starting with the four classic sort of Greek periodic table of elements: earth, fire, air, fire, and water. And from these, they tried to reduce them to even simpler entities: Thales with water, Anaximander with the unlimited, and Anaximenes with air or fire. They thus sought to answer a fundamental metaphysical question: what is the universe made of? What exactly is out there? In contrast, the Pythagoreans sought to reduce the same material realities to a simpler scheme, but in their case, it was mathematical objects. And that sort of reduction of objects to mathematical entities highlighted the ways in which mathematics help us model our experience of the natural world. And it is, of course, not coincidental that philosophy begins this rigorous mode of rational discourse in a culture which had mastered deductive mathematics in both Euclidean geometry and obviously in the work of Pythagoras himself. Heraclitus and Parmenides, the great opponents on the metaphysics of the post-Pythagorean epoch, address the problem of not what the universe is made of, but rather the question of change and continuity. How does change occur? Is change possible? In approaching these questions in an abstract and logical way, it was really they who helped give rise to metaphysics as a logical discipline, as a discipline based on abstract reasoning. Both the dynamism of Heraclitus and the monism of the Eleatics would have far-reaching influences on subsequent thinkers across centuries. For example, Nietzsche drew heavily on Heraclitus for philosophical inspiration. He was deeply moved by Heraclitus' sense of flux and chaos and strife in the universe. On the other hand, there are very deep and obvious affinities between the monistic cosmology of Parmenides and, say, the monistic determinism of Baruch Spinoza in the 17th century. Well, the second phase of pre-Socratic thought turned from an analysis of the world of objects or nature to the study of the human world, the world of subjects. Now, this was in fact, in part at least, the result of the profusion of doctrines about nature, each of which was equally persuasive and each of which contradicted the others. And this profusion of equally persuasive doctrines generally tends to produce skepticism. This skepticism about the possibility of reliable knowledge about nature caused thinkers to turn to the human and social world for knowledge. Now, both Heraclitus and the Pythagoreans had in fact offered ethical doctrines, though of a radically different nature. But the critical figures here are really the sophists, because the sophists represent the first full-blown engagement with the problems of politics, ethics, and human sociability. Their analysis was empirical. They studied constitutions, they studied political practices in a realistic fashion, and their empirical analyses and readings of political motivation and power formed the basis for subsequent political science as well as subsequent political philosophy. Particularly important was their discovery of the role of convention and custom, as opposed to regular mathematical law in human affairs, which finally forced us to realize that much of our political values and social values are in fact culturally determined and conventional, vary from place to place and time to time. Well, this brings us to really the high point of the ancient world, the development of the great classical Greek philosophers, all from Athens, or lived in Athens: Socrates, his student Plato, and his student Aristotle, all of whom drew heavily on pre-Socratic traditions, as well as obviously each other's teachings, to construct what really constitute the first full-blown philosophical systems, particularly in the thought of Plato and Aristotle. Well, let's begin with Socrates, and really his, I think, great breakthrough and most important doctrine was the development of ethical rationalism, the belief that people act on the basis of what they think is good. There is no perversion of the will, which means that immoral action is the result of a failure of knowledge rather than a failure of character, and also taught that ethical knowledge was, of course, teachable. Now, the Sophists had taught that morality and political order were based on convention, and were therefore obviously relative to those conventions. Socrates rejected these skeptical conclusions. Instead, he insisted that ethical truths were absolute and demonstrable, and his model of this was obviously geometry. That through carefully defining ethical terms, grasping their essence as it were, we could arrive at final and fixed moral and ethical truths. And as I've mentioned, Socrates taught that these truths were not only rational, but were teachable. And that has a profound implication for the role of the philosopher, because if one can teach virtue, and if the only thing barring virtuous behavior is a lack of knowledge on the part of people, that means that the philosopher, as ethical teacher, takes on a critical and indeed a primary role within the polis or political community, as well as the culture, as an instructor and censor of politics and morals. Socrates also taught that all people, as I've mentioned, act on the basis of their beliefs, and thus the problem of morality is really a problem of knowledge, not will, very antithetical to the Christian tradition. And this was summed up in his famous expression, "To know the good is to do the good." But this makes ethical philosophy the sine qua non of a just and stable social and political order. So it really placed philosophy at the center of Athenian cultural life, at least in its own understanding. Well, Socrates' student Plato injected his teacher's ethical rationalism into a remarkable overarching philosophical synthesis. Plato's metaphysics were designed to address the problem of change, which had been raised by Heraclitus and the Eleatics, Parmenides and Zeno. And his doctrine of forms, essences, or ideas, was clearly meant to divide natural objects into their, on the one hand, their structures, or essential natures, what he called forms, and their material contents. This helped resolve the problem of change, because the forms were definable, and therefore eternal and unchangeable. Whereas it was the latter, and it was the material content of things that was subject to change. For Plato, this also had profound epistemological implications, precisely because the forms were definable and eternal. They were subjects, and in fact the only subjects, of rational knowledge. On the other hand, changes which come from the material principle cannot be reduced to abstract, definable terms. Therefore, he argues, in a sense, we can never have a truly scientific understanding of change in the physical world. Well, Plato used this dualism of form and content to argue that the forms of things were in some sense metaphysically distinct from and prior to the material objects that, quote, participated in them. Which is to say, although all objects we come in contact with are a mixture of form and matter, that the forms actually exist independently in some metaphysical realm and have more reality because they're more knowable and eternal than the particular things which participate in those forms. In this way, Plato offered the first full-blown dualist ontology, or a view that beyond our own realm of sense and appearance, there is another realm, another world of eternal and unchanging truth. Now, Plato's ethical and political doctrines were informed by his adoption of Socrates' ethical rationalism. Since for Plato, politics is simply ethics writ large, summed up in that wonderful sentence in the Republic, "The city is like the man," Plato assumes that philosophy, or rational inquiry, is capable of generating the same sort of absolute certainty for the polis that it can for the ethical life of the individual. This means that Plato's political thought is not only descriptive, as had been the case with the sophists, but is also prescriptive, that it holds out a model or blueprint which we are ethically obliged to try to bring to realization. And it is that prescriptive understanding of political philosophy that will be the source for much of the subsequent idealist tradition in political speculation. And in particular, if we look at the Republic, we will find doctrines there which will have a long legacy in that idealist tradition, such as communism. Plato was the first to critique private property as a source of social injustice. Feminism. Plato was the first to argue for the equality of women insofar as they participate in mathematical rationality. And ultimately, what I think was implied to some extent in Socrates' thought, the rule of philosophers and philosophy within the state and the culture. Plato's psychology drew on his metaphysics in that it's again based on a dualism of soul or form and body, material content. But Plato further analyzed the psyche or soul into three distinct faculties or functions. The rational or calculative part of our minds, which engage in mathematical analysis, the spirited part of our minds, which are part of our courage and our sense of ego, and the appetitive part, that which desires. Each of these correspond to a different social class in the Republic, and of course the Platonic ideal is one in which a healthy soul is governed by the rational faculty with the aid of that spirited faculty or ego-bearing will over the base animal appetites. And again, this is a scheme that would have a very long history. We could think of the Christian notion of each soul or ego being tempted by, on the one hand, demonic urges corresponding to Plato's appetite, or angels being the intellective or moral part. Or we could also compare it to Freud's tripartite analysis of the mind into a superego, again much like Plato's intellective part, an ego, Plato's spirited part, and the id, the appetitive or libidinous part. Well, Plato's student Aristotle adopted the overall approach of his mentor, but he criticized some of his central doctrines on what we would call realistic grounds. Aristotle rejected the metaphysical separation of form and content, arguing that forms exist only in their participation in actual things, that objects, although admittedly made of form and content, do not allow us to infer that there exists a separate world of forms themselves. Aristotle resolved the problem of change not through Plato's hylomorphism, but rather through his own doctrine of entelechy, which held that natural objects have natural ends or potentials towards which they tend if not interrupted. The acorn, under the right conditions, becomes the oak. The child, under the right conditions, becomes the adult. Even inanimate objects tend to rest unless moved, and all objects tend toward their natural level. Aristotle further postulated a fourfold causal nexus, which will be explored in subsequent lectures, of formal, material, efficient, and final, which would have an immense impact on European thought all the way up to the scientific revolution. And it was an analysis that synthesized his metaphysics with the science of his day, and Aristotle was quite a scientist. For him, the soul is the final cause of motion in organic matter. It's the entelechy of the person. And he identified four forms of souls, the ultimate form of which is the pure actuality of God, the prime mover who sits atop the chain of being. Now, Aristotle also criticized the conclusions of Plato's political and ethical philosophy, again on realistic grounds. He rejects the communal arrangements of his teacher as impractical, and offers instead an empirical account of the various forms of states and the factors that determine these forms, social factors and economic factors. he did this instead of what he considered an illusory quest for that one best true form. Again, rather than rule by philosopher kings, Aristotle inclines towards the republican rule of a broad middle class. And in many ways, Aristotle is, as the realist, is the founder of modern realistic political thought, as well as the whole realistic tradition of practical philosophy, metaphysics, and epistemology. Finally, Aristotle also held that justice and virtue are not, in fact, pure sciences, mathematically demonstrable, as Socrates and Plato had taught, but are rather the result of practical judgment or phronesis. That one learns the truth of political association and how to live one's life well, not by abstract reasoning, but by practical life and by learning from experience. Well, our final epoch, that of the Hellenic and Roman worlds, inherited these classical doctrines and incorporated them into their own philosophic perspectives. Now, many historians have noted that this epoch produces very little of original systematic philosophical speculation. In its stead, what late Hellenics and Romans did do was draw on classical philosophy in what I would call a syncretic fashion. And they did this to respond to the undermining of traditional religious supports for public and spiritual life. What I mean by syncretic is that they draw together as many different strands as possible to sort of weave syntheses that will help them navigate their way through their cultural worlds. For example, the Stoics and Epicureans tried to give meaning and direction to ethical and spiritual life without recourse to traditional mythologies. They both attempted to give rational models of life, ones that did not depend on religious beliefs. The Stoic ideal of a life lived according to nature, again, one which draws on Socratic teachings, projected a rational order on the cosmos and demanded of its adherents a reverential piety as well as the self-discipline of a life lived by the dictates of reason. By contrast, the Epicureans sought the good life in the Aristotelian pursuit of cultivated pleasures. I state this because they did not see it in the pursuit of crude carnal hedonism. And in particular, they thought the good life consisted of those pleasures that please the mind and produce intellectual satisfactions, a very Aristotelian doctrine. Similarly, thinkers like Cicero or Polybius practiced a philosophical eclecticism, whereby they selectively drew on different elements of different philosophies to construct their own unique worldviews. Cicero, for example, combined Socratic and Stoic conceptions of virtue and duty with Aristotelian political philosophy, that practical realistic analysis of existing regimes, to produce a political credo for late Republican Rome. Skepticism emerged in the late Roman period and Hellenic period as a result of the profusion of metaphysical and philosophical doctrines in that period. Skepticism led to a return to the quest for merely practical certainty. We see this in figures like Sextus Empiricus. But it also led to an openness to extra-rational sources of cosmology and metaphysics, to an openness to more traditional and perhaps more faith-based and emotionally based understandings of the world and participations in meaningful spiritual existence. And this is reflected in the epoch by the rise of mystery cults, Mithraism being one of the most famous, though ultimately the most successful of them, was, of course, Christianity. And in a sense, we could say the rise of skepticism brings the trajectory of ancient philosophy full circle. Ancient philosophy began with a skepticism. The Milesians, Ionians, engaged in philosophic disputation and the construction of a science of nature because they had been subject to a variety of different religious interpretations of the world that led them to be skeptical about religious interpretations.